Hi everyone, I found a box in an attic and it's full of old newspapers from the First and the Second World Wars. I've got about 100 or so copies of something called the Great War that's from the First World War, and then maybe 200 copies of this thing called the News Review that was published in the 1930s and the 1940s. It was actually about 5 years ago. I was helping to clear out my wife's parents' house because it had to be sold to pay for nursing home fees, and it was up in the attic tucked right under the eaves. I found this big box with all these bundles of newspapers all tied up with string. Now the house in question, it was owned by my wife's parents, but before them it was owned by her grandparents. It was actually built in the 1930s by my wife's grandfather George. Now we know George was born in 1892, we know he died in 1966, and we know that he fought in the First World War, so I'm guessing these were George's. And I'm finding them really fascinating because, you know, unlike the history books, they're not written in hindsight by historians. You were actually reading the news as it was printed at the time. So it's a real chance to kind of imagine what it must have been like to be consuming the news in the 1930s and the 1940s, you know, waking up every morning and wondering what was going to happen. So I've decided to create a YouTube channel. It's called Not History But News. And for the last couple of months I've been picking out news stories that I think are of interest and just presenting them for people to look at. There have been a couple about the sinking of ships, and they give real detailed accounts of what happened, and it's the news at the time, so you're kind of reading it a few days or a week or so after it actually happened. For example, in October of 1939, there's an article about the sinking of HMS Royal Oak, which was shot by a torpedo by a German U-boat in Scapa Flow. 1,200 people on board, 400 saved, so about 800 people died. And it's a news story, so it's reporting it as it happened. There's quite a section about the commander of the U-boat, who apparently got loads of praise in Berlin and was promoted. But it is really interesting to see how the news was presented at the time. And then in November 1939 we have an article about the sinking of HMS Rawalpindi, which was torpedoed by a German battleship, the Deutschland. 285 men were lost. The captain E.C. Kennedy, who was a 60-year-old captain, he went down with the ship. And it's quite an intimate, it was the news as it was reported at the time, and it is quite horrific in parts. It's some details of some of the rescues. Merchant cruiser Churchill was the ship that came to the rescue, and there's quite a lot about the German Gross Admiral Erich Raeder, who was apparently not a supporter of Hitler. He was anti-Nazi, but nonetheless was the head of the German Navy during the Second World War. And then on the 14th of December 1939, First Admiral Winston Churchill gave a speech in the House of Commons marking the first 100 days of war and listing the ships that had been lost in that time and the German U-boats that had been sunk. And kind of setting out the scores so far, really. But it was covered in the press, and there's some quite detailed accounts of a couple of the sinkings. HMS Navasota, it's really actually quite horrific, that the report of some of the sailors who drowned because they were trapped in the ship as it went down. But that's how it was reported in the press at the time. And then in October 1939, there's a report of the very first air raid over Britain, which was over the Firth of Forth. And it's quite interesting the way the press deal with it, because they paint a picture of the British Air Force being fantastic and the German Air Force being a load of rubbish. You know, it's hard to judge how true that is and whether that's just propaganda, but that's how things were being reported in the press at the time. And then in December 1939, the paper ran an article about Hitler's girlfriends, and it lists kind of about 5 or 6 women that he apparently had relationships with, and talks about them, and talks about what they then had to say after the war about their relationships with Hitler. Which is quite interesting. I mean, the only name I'd ever heard of in that regard was Eva Braun, but it lists a handful of women who he apparently had relationships with. And then I picked out a few short articles to make some YouTube shorts. There's one about the femme fatale spy. This is an interview with a secret agent who wrote a book about all the female spies that he's known. He claimed to have slept with Mata Hari. And so that's quite good. There's then Labour's 1939 vision for a new world order. This is a speech that Clement Attlee did in 1939, which is fascinating. I mean, you can see the early signs of what later became the United Nations, but Attlee thought that the UN would have the most powerful army in the world and no other nation would be allowed to have an army, was the kind of picture that he was painting. And then there's one about child evacuees. It's called Horrible Children, and it's fascinating the way the press have dealt with it, because they seem to feel really sorry for the middle class families that have to put up with these dreadful children from the slums. And you know, it's just so different to how any modern day press article would deal with an issue like that. It's fascinating. Then there's one about a 14-year-old mess boy on a ship that got hit by a torpedo, and his account of what happened and spending the night on a lifeboat before they got picked up. And then I've got loads more to go at. I came across an article yesterday where the paper is speculating about who is going to be the next Prime Minister after Neville Chamberlain. There's kind of 3 or 4 people in the running, including Lord Halifax, including some bloke called Winston Churchill. And it's really interesting to see how that article evolves and the pros and cons of the different candidates, and kind of go through that at the time. There's an article about Walter Messerschmitt, the guy who invented the fighter plane. Again, not a supporter of Hitler, and this article is saying he's disappeared and nobody knows where he's gone. And obviously I'm just at the beginning, you know, I've got 200 of these running right through the Second World War, so there'll be loads more to come. So please take a look at my channel, not history but news. And if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.